It was a calm night. The soft sounds of streetlights and the occasional car passing by filled the air. Marcus Taylor was driving home with his close friend Darius after a nice event. They enjoyed a comfortable silence, reflecting on their evening, when suddenly, Marcus noticed flashing blue lights in the rearview mirror. A police car was following them. "Why are they pulling us over?" Darius asked, a puzzled look on his face. They hadn't been speeding or doing anything wrong. "I have no idea," Marcus replied, pulling the car over to the side of the road. He sighed, feeling the weight of what might come next. Even as a respected man, he knew all too well the dangers that came with being a black man in America. Two young officers approached the car. Officer Riley, the younger one, reached Marcus's window first. His face was stern and aggressive. Without greeting them or explaining why they were stopped, he barked, "License and registration." Staying calm, Marcus handed over his ID. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, trying to keep the tension from rising. Officer Riley barely glanced at the ID before turning to Darius. "You too," he snapped, signaling for Darius's identification. Darius hesitated, sensing the unfairness in the air, but he handed over his ID with a slight frown. Marcus watched closely, noticing the young officer's tense shoulders. This wasn't a normal stop. It felt much more serious. After a quick look at their IDs, Officer Riley exchanged a glance with his partner, Officer Grant. They didn't recognize who Marcus was. Instead, Officer Riley stepped back and whispered something to Officer Grant. "Step out of the vehicles," Riley ordered, his voice sharp. Marcus felt a tightness in his chest. "Step out," Marcus repeated, trying to stay steady. "Can you tell me why we were pulled over?" "You're acting suspiciously," Riley replied coldly, reaching for his handcuffs. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Darius looked at Marcus, worry in his eyes. "This is wrong," he muttered under his breath. But Marcus knew arguing wouldn't help. They stepped out of the car slowly, carefully. In moments, both men were handcuffed, standing in the bright lights of the police car, feeling the weight of injustice around them. The officers walked back to their patrol car to check their IDs, leaving Marcus and Darius by the roadside. Minutes felt like hours, and every passing car slowed down to look, their drivers curious about the scene unfolding before them. Marcus leaned toward Darius, his voice low but controlled. "Why did they stop us?" His frustration was barely hidden. "I don't know, but this doesn't feel right," Darius replied, irritation clear in his tone. "It's like they're fishing for something." Just then, the officers returned. Officer Riley, with his hardened expression, looked at them with narrowed eyes. "Step out of the vehicle, now," he barked, hand resting on his holster. Sensing the tension rising, Marcus remained calm, though the weight of the situation pressed down on him. Without explanation, both men stepped out of the car slowly, making sure not to make any sudden moves. "Can you tell us what this is about, officer?" Marcus asked, his voice steady, but filled with disbelief. "You're acting suspiciously," Riley replied sharply, as if that was enough reason. Without waiting for an answer, he pulled out handcuffs and secured Marcus's wrists. Officer Grant did the same to Darius. "This isn't right," Darius protested, his eyes wide with disbelief, but his words were ignored. The humiliation stung as their dignity slipped away in front of onlookers. They were led toward the police car, hearts pounding together. People driving by stared, their eyes lingering on the scene, a scene they'd likely seen before. But this time, it was Marcus and Darius in the spotlight, two respected men reduced to stereotypes in an instant. An overwhelming feeling of powerlessness washed over Marcus. He knew they hadn't done anything wrong. This was happening because of the color of their skin. But knowing this didn't make it easier to accept. As they were placed against the car, their minds raced. Should they speak up and risk making things worse, or stay silent and hope the situation wouldn't escalate? The frustration, fear, and anger were almost unbearable. The humiliation of being treated like criminals while knowing they'd done nothing wrong burned deep. They stood there, handcuffed under the flashing lights, uncertain about what would come next and wondering if anyone would believe their story. Officer Grant, standing a few feet away, started to feel uneasy. Something didn't sit right with him. He walked back to the patrol car and ran Marcus's ID through the police database. As the results flashed on the screen, his heart skipped a beat. His eyes widened in shock, and he quickly glanced back at Marcus, still in handcuffs. Grant rushed over to Officer Riley and whispered urgently, "Do you know who that is?" Riley, confused, shook his head. "No, who cares? They fit the description." "That's Captain Marcus Taylor," Grant said quietly. "He's a high-ranking officer, our boss." The color drained from Riley's face as the realization hit him. He tightened his grip on his flashlight, frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the weight of his mistake. He quickly motioned to Grant, and together they hurried over to Marcus and Darius, fumbling to remove their handcuffs. "We didn't know, sir," Officer Grant stammered as he unlocked Marcus's cuffs. "Captain Taylor, I'm so sorry. There's been a misunderstanding." Now free, Marcus rubbed his wrists and looked at the officers with a calm but piercing gaze. His disappointment was clear, cutting through the night sharper than any angry outburst could have. "That's the problem," he said. Marcus spoke slowly, filled with authority. "You didn't ask." Officer Riley stood there, speechless, his face reflecting the realization of their mistake. Darius, now uncuffed, stepped forward. "If this is how you treat someone like him," he said, nodding toward Marcus, "how do you treat the rest of us?" The backup officers who had arrived ready for trouble now shifted uncomfortably. They had been prepared for a fight, but instead, they faced the truth. They had nearly arrested one of their own leaders based purely on an assumption. As Marcus and Darius turned to walk back to their car, Marcus paused. He looked over his shoulder at Officer Riley and Grant, both frozen in their guilt. "You need to think about why you treated us like this," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. "This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's judged before they're even heard." With that, Marcus and Darius got back into the car, leaving the officers in stunned silence. The flashing lights still cast long shadows across the empty street. The next day, news of the arrest spread quickly through the police department. Officers whispered about how close Riley and Grant had come to disaster, how they had treated a respected captain like a common suspect. Officer Riley faced disciplinary action, and Marcus led a meeting about racial profiling, forcing the department to confront uncomfortable truths. Later that evening, Marcus and Darius sat together, reflecting on everything that had happened. Despite his rank, Marcus realized that he wasn't immune to the injustices that so many face every day. "This isn't over," Marcus said softly, filled with determination. "We have more work to do." Darius nodded. "We do. No one should have to go through that." Shaken but resolute, they vowed to continue their fight for change, knowing the work was far from finished. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe for more powerful content and stories that make you think. And don't forget to drop a comment below to let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you.